Hi, thanks for watching. Okay, so in this video, I'd like to take sort of a deep dive into two very important aspects of NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, narcissism, just subclinical narcissism, and also just cluster B in general. Okay, which is the phenomenon, and this is a very serious issue. It's idealization and fantasy. Okay, so idealization and fantasy. These are two gigantic components of cluster B, narcissism, and NPD. Okay. And, I'm the kind of person where it doesn't really matter to me if you have the full blown disorder or if you just have traits of the disorder. The fact is that anybody who falls into a lot of idealization and fantasy, even if they do have empathy, even if they don't really qualify as an NPD narcissist, um, somebody who has a lot of idealization and fantasy, these are kind of cluster B. This is sort of cluster B psychology that can get people into a lot of trouble in life, and it can be very difficult to deal with. Okay, because basically, somebody who's dealing with a lot of idealization and fantasy, they probably had a lot of suffering in life. They probably had a lot of not a very quality life, maybe even kind of a sort of a poverty in a sense, where even if they've grown up with money economically, not poor, but if you grow up in a family where the environment of the family is prone to a lot of idealization and fantasy, in a sense, that's kind of a poverty in itself. It's sort of a psychological poverty. Okay, and I think psychologically, when a person comes from poverty, it's really hard to believe that justice would allow for, let's say, getting out of poverty to mean any kind of suffering. Okay, so basically, somebody who comes from a background of any kind of poverty is going to feel profoundly unjust. It would feel profoundly unjust to come out of that into a life of difficulty. Okay, so in a sense, in a weird way, when we come from poverty, whether it's economic or psychological poverty, we sort of have an internal expectation that we cannot really move out into a life that's difficult. That there's sort of an escapism where we have to believe that justice requires a much more blissful, pleasant sort of way out of where we're at. Okay, and that's the trap, because real life and the kind of life that's not given to a lot of fantasy and idealization is actually a life that has a lot more difficulty, a lot more discomfort than what we would expect. And so in a funny way, when we come out of a background of poverty, we're not really conditioned to know what to expect in a so-called better life. Okay. And a lot of times, because we see people who seem to be very carefree, living very easy lives with a lot more abundance, we sort of have this idea that the world of abundance is a world of sort of more relaxation, more ease, and less difficulty. Okay, and we don't realize that abundance kind of goes together with being able to handle more difficulty, more turmoil, more unpleasantness. Okay, now maybe the reason why people who have a lot of abundance, why they seem so calm and so relaxed and so pleasant and so unbothered, is maybe not because their life is actually less complex or has less frustrations. It may be because they have better conditioning. Okay, so it's just a big tangled web where if we come from a poverty environment, psychological poverty especially, the one factor we're not thinking about when we think about getting out of poverty, going into a more ideal, a more fantastical life, a better life, or a life of abundance, the one thing we're not taking into account is psychological conditioning. Okay, and we have to be honest. Okay, one of the byproducts of poverty, and I think to me this is the part where poverty kind of spoils us, and this is hard to believe. It seems unjust. It seems like I'm poverty blaming, or I'm putting poverty people down or whatever. But any of us who have had poverty in our lives, there is a spoiling effect of being in poverty. Okay, a spoiling effect. It's kind of weird. For whatever reason, what I've seen with people in my own case coming from poverty, I came from a situation of psychological poverty in my family. We were poor in our psychological quality. Did not have a lot of psychological maturity, emotional maturity in my family. So one of the sad realities that we have to take to heart coming out of poverty is that we are kind of spoiled by poverty. Okay, because while there are hardships in poverty, okay, um, at least if we come from a background of psychological or emotional poverty, okay, there is one area where we are spoiled, okay, in that we have not developed psychological conditioning. Okay, we're not conditioned, all right. And so while we live with a lot of hardship and while we may develop certain calluses, okay, there's one thing that we haven't learned how to do in a psychologically impoverished environment, which is to process, to hold and process uncomfortable psychological experience. Okay. So basically, what do I mean by that? I think to me, the classic hallmark of a impoverished family, a psychologically impoverished family, is that whether it's the parents, whether it's the brothers, whether it's the cousins, the siblings, whatever, parents, grandparents, whoever's in that, let's say, unhealthy, toxic emotional environment, the pervasive theme is when people are irritated, when people are stressed, when people are provoked, bothered, they're very quick off the handle. Okay, they've got short fuses. Okay, they're spring loaded. Okay, so that the one thing you never see or rarely see in these families is people holding and tolerating provocations, discomforts, conflict, tension, dissonance. Okay, everything is a rash reaction, everything's a quick reaction. And so the one thing that's not getting passed around in that family is the conditioning. And it takes conditioning. You don't just do it because you have a good attitude. You have to condition for this. But the conditioning to be able to hold turmoil, discomfort, provocation, even injustice, and to hold it and not to react. Okay. And that takes conditioning. It's not just having a good attitude. Okay. If you just have a good attitude, that's great, but you need to have conditioning. It's like muscles. You have to develop the conditioning to be able to hold discomforts, conflict, dissonances, just things that are just uncomfortable, unfair, and hold them as opposed to reacting or escaping. Okay. Now you may see the father, he doesn't say anything when things are unfair. He doesn't say anything when he's provoked, but he starts drinking or he just gets real quiet. That's not really processing. That's just kind of like unplugging or dissociating or whatever. So in other words, in an impoverished environment, you don't see the healthy conditioning where people, without having to go to their beers or their cigarettes or their overeating or their pornography or just checking out, oh, I'm going to leave, go and leave the house and leave for 4 hours. Instead, being present and actually holding and dealing with discomfort and, conflicting, provocative things without having to get a quick disposal, a quick reaction, a quick processing, just holding discomfort. Okay. So in a sense, coming from an impoverished environment, we have that spoiling effect that there is never an opportunity in these environments, no modeling, no example, no atmosphere where it is let's say a family value or, where it's a habit, an obvious habit to hold and to condition oneself to hold and to contain discomfort and strain and things that are not pleasant and things that are not ideal. Okay. So we don't have that conditioning. Okay. So what happens? We get a distorted psychology from that. So obviously, yes, it is unpleasant to be in a toxic environment. It's chaotic, it's ugly, it's unhygienic, it's just clearly not the ideal way to live. And obviously you're going to fantasize about the alternative, which is, maybe better looking people who can handle things better, people who have more abundance, people who are more privileged, whatever. You're going to come up with all the, you're going to look out in the world and you're going to see it according to how your experience, has conditioned you. Okay. So you're going to see the alternative to being impoverished, let's say. But you're not going to see that the one thing that is missing and the one thing that's not being addressed is conditioning to handle and to hold, discomfort and conflict and unpleasantness. Okay. And we also don't realize, and this is so important, that when we see people who look like their lives are very easy and they have abundance and they're more privileged and everything seems just kind of to click into place and kind of effortless, we don't take into account how much their ability to multitask and their ability to just do, have success and manage things. We don't take into account how they have a lot of conditioning that's already second nature. Okay. So that they don't have to think about it. They're just conditioned. And then maybe we, as people who come from poverty, we don't have that conditioning. Okay. And so we're not taking into account that that's one of the missing factors in being able to have a more complex, a more privileged, a more abundant life, is that you actually have more conditioning to handle, just the shocks and the just the chaos and just the turmoil of actually a real life, especially a life that would involve any kind of success. Okay. So, and the same thing with relationships, when you come out of an environment of poverty where people are kind of, they don't take care of themselves. They're not very attractive. They're just, unhealthy, basically. Obviously, when you see more healthy people, when you see more attractive people who are in a better place, you're just going to focus on the fact that it looks so nice and they're so nice looking. Okay. But again, we forget the part where there's more conditioning. Those people might have more conditioning, and they also might have more natural, let's say, they genetically might be more conditioned without even practice, whatever. But we're not taking into account the aspect of conditioning. Okay. That's also a part of it. So if we do happen to have the opportunity, let's say, to get into a relationship with a more attractive person or a person who comes from a better social class, okay, we're going to think, oh my God, I made it. Now I'm with these beautiful people. Okay. But you're forgetting that part of being at that level, so a little bit, may be a different level of conditioning. Okay. And we don't think about that. Okay. We don't think about that. We just think about being with the nice people who behave better. And we just think if we can just mimic their behavior, if we can just kind of act the part. But we forget that just having a good attitude and acting the part, we're still forgetting one aspect, and we're overlooking something, which is the actual conditioning. Okay. And there's no substitute for being in condition. Okay. Psychologically in condition. So in other words, we bring our poverty and we take it into where we're going, even though we camouflage it with good behavior and with good sort of ideals and let's say a good attitude, but we don't bring the conditioning with us. Okay. And I think that's the spoiled part. That is how poverty spoils us. Okay. And I think we need to see it that way. Poverty spoils us because we never get that gymnasium. We never have to go to the gymnasium of conditioning ourselves to tolerate lots of multitasking, lots of demands, lots of conflict, lots of discomfort, lots of strain, things that are unfair, tolerating, and not just tolerating, but holding and not crumbling, not dissolving. In other words, because we rise to that by being in condition to have a certain carrying capacity where we can carry and hold discomforts. It's like the difference between being a tiny little like Ford Focus and being like the highest, like the best off-road Jeep or Hummer. You know what I mean? Like imagine like the safari vehicles they use to go off-road in Africa. They're like these Land Cruisers or these Land Rovers or whatever. They have such beefed up suspension. They have these great tires. And you compare that to like a Ford Focus. Take a Ford Focus and try to ride it in Africa, like off-road in a safari. It's like, the tires will blow within half a mile. You need, the difference is having like building up your resilience and your strength, your emotional strength and your emotional endurance to be more like the Jeep, you know what I mean? The off-roading vehicle that can take more punishment, that can take more, these are things that are, we don't think about these things, but I just want to put it out there that and this may seem cruel. It may seem cruel, but we need to take to heart. If any of us come from any kind of impoverished environment, whether it's economic poverty or whether it's psychological poverty. I came from a background of psychological poverty. Basically, we have to consider that we may have been spoiled by that poverty in a sense. And try to take this in the best possible way. I'm not saying this as a way of being right wing and you just want to beat down on people who are poor and no, it's just being realistic. Okay, if I come from an impoverished environment, yes, there are some ways in which I've suffered injustice and I've suffered, let's say, miseries and pains that other people cannot relate to. That may be true, but I also have come from an environment where there hasn't been the resource, the gymnasium offered, and it hasn't been modeled and it hasn't been put into practice in that environment where people can hold, truly hold, okay, a lot of, let's say, discomfort and frustration and have psychological conditioning to hold and process a lot of, let's say, just the discomforts of life, just the tribulations and the challenges of life, okay? Call it major frustration tolerance, call it turbulence tolerance, whatever. So that part is missing, okay? I think in most cases, and again, just think about it. You go to a poor family, yeah, there's a lot of suffering. There is a lot of suffering, but you'll notice that when people are provoked and when people are challenged and when they're threatened and when they're presented with, just difficult, just the provocations of life, there is a tendency to react more. There is a tendency to go to let's say the smoking or the pornography or, whatever, and just not just nakedly holding and dealing with, let's say, the challenges, the dissonances, the provocations, the unfairness, the injustices, whatever, and just to be able to hold things, you know what I mean? And so, I don't know, I just put it out there, but I think, I guess politically, when we talk about, rescuing people from poverty, we always think of it as, well, what can we give them? 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 Okay. And that's fine. I'm not opposed to that, but there also has to be consideration for what are their deficits in conditioning. Okay. So in other words, if somebody's coming out of poverty, any kind of poverty, yes, there may be some aspect to which they need resources. Okay, that's fine. But there's another aspect, which is, okay, so you look at a person coming out of poverty, okay, and you look at, okay, what are their needs? What are some of the needs that are not being met? Okay, fine, okay. But then there's another dimension. What are some of the areas in which these people are not conditioned, okay? And so both are true. Okay. In other words, yeah, there may be some needs that are not met. Maybe they don't have hygienic housing or whatever. But at the same time, parallel to that, okay, and it goes with it, it's tandem. What is their ability? What is their conditioning to be able to deal with the natural frustrations of a life? Okay. So in other words, if you just give people a more hygienic house, let's say you take someone out of poverty and just give them a nice clean house. Okay. If they don't have, if you don't also address their conditioning as people, their discipline and conditioning, they're not going to be able to maintain that house as a hygienic house. Okay. It'll slowly get dirty. It'll slowly become sort of in disrepair. Okay. So basically what I'm saying is that we need to look at both things. Okay. In other words, if you want to improve the quality of life for somebody coming out of poverty, there may be, to some extent, having more access to, let's say, just minimum decent conditions to live. Okay. Yes. But in order to inhabit that, okay, in order to deserve it, we also have to look at where there are deficits in the conditioning of anybody coming out of poverty. And I include myself. Okay. I still struggle with it, actually. I still struggle with it. I still have aspects of poverty in myself because I never was conditioned as a young person. Okay. And even as an adult, my conditioning is I slip all the time because I'm just, it's not my natural state. I wasn't born to be, and I wasn't raised to be a psychologically conditioned person. So I'm always kind of slipping, and I have to really make a point of really seeking psychological conditioning. So I'm just saying that, whenever we're dealing with people in a poverty situation, it's naive just to look at what do they need given to them. What more do they need resources given to them? Yes, that's a part, but the other part, and neither part can stand without the other, okay, is to what extent is each person coming out of poverty, as we assess each person, are they lacking in a certain psychological conditioning? Okay, that's also important. All right. And so I think that when we look at idealization and fantasy coming out of the poverty that produces NPD and cluster B. And again, it doesn't have to be economic poverty. It doesn't even have to be an abusive family, actually. It could even be genetic poverty, where genetically a person just doesn't have a lot of conditioning and resilience, tolerance to frustration. They could be very irritable, okay? Or you could come from a super, super privileged family and you're so spoiled, combined with having that delicate temperament, okay? When they all come together, and because you're so spoiled and you're so privileged that you have almost zero frustration tolerance, okay? And you have almost zero tolerance for things that really go against your, things that really challenge you, things that you find really unjust. You have no carrying capacity. You see what I mean? So in a sense, you could come from a family of billionaires or whatever, and you could be also have the genetics, the irritability, but you could come out of that impoverished in that you're very poor psychologically. Okay. So you have psychological poverty. All right. And I just have to reflect when I watch some videos, I guess they were like documentaries about Paris Hilton. Okay. It was interesting because I could see how wealthy she was. Okay. I could see how wealthy she was. But when I saw how the actual family played out and I saw how her early years as an adolescent, and just kind of the dynamics of the family, the family, the father is just basically, he's just inherited millions of dollars, but I could almost pick up how, at least at a gut level, it felt like they had lots of money, but I could almost see a sort of poverty in just the quality of the family. Okay. The emotional quality of the family. And obviously, not every sibling turned out the same. I think Paris Hilton had more trouble than her sister, but basically it all combined. Let's say her temperament, let's say her special upbringing, her circumstances, to produce a kind of life that I can identify as sort of having aspects of poverty. Okay. Just, the broader sense of poverty. All right. So basically, as we're looking at sort of the poverty that is sort of the origin of a lot of cluster B, a lot of NPD, a lot of narcissism, that we don't just look at how, as we start to imagine a better life, how can we get better resources? How can we, sort of undo the trauma, what was done to that person, the suffering. Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's one aspect, the sort of like what bad happened to that person. Okay, fine. But the other part that cannot be ignored as we look towards, let's say, moving out of let's say, that bad condition is what aspects of conditioning have we not developed? Okay. And that I think is important. I think without addressing that, I think there is no real recovery. And now we can understand a little more how sort of unhealthy is the way of thinking of a person who's in the poverty situation. Let's say the poverty of cluster B, the poverty of narcissism. Okay. And so they're constantly imagining a better place that they can be with better looking people, with a better environment, more abundance. And they're only looking at like one aspect of what it means to be outside of poverty. And they're not looking at the other aspect, which is I could be better conditioned. Okay. And it's just funny, you look at one aspect, you don't look at the other. And I think even in our politics, as we talk about, let's say, the problems of how to deal with poor people. Okay. And I look broadly at poor people who have either economic poverty or emotional, psychological poverty. Okay. And basically what can we do? And we're always talking about the resources we can offer, but how often do we talk about the conditioning that they need to rise to, and I think that's very important. So it's just my opinion that if we can learn as a culture, okay, to look at people who are unfortunate, people who have issues, psychological issues, anything like that, and look at it in two steps. How can we, let's say, take away the unhealthy, toxic, the things that are sort of like the the traumas or whatever. Okay, fine, but at the same time, okay, let's focus on case by case basis. But with each person, what is their set? What is their area where they don't have conditioning? Okay, where people are lacking in conditioning. All right. And so to me, that has to be a focus. And at some point, in our culture, we have to make it sort of like an understood thing that apart from the resources, apart from putting people in a better environment, at the same time, in order to deserve that environment and to be able to hold that better position. Okay. That it becomes sort of like a natural thought in our culture, just in our culture, that you don't get out of poverty without also focusing on the areas, the big areas in each person's life where we don't have psychological conditioning. Okay. And just like today, it's so common. There's gyms all over the place, and, getting physically fit, CrossFit, dieting, getting your body. Okay. At the very same time, yoga, all these things. Well, just as much as that, we should maybe bring into our cultural awareness, the importance of being psychologically fit. Okay. And psychological fitness is, in a sense, a big part of it is being able to hold and tolerate uncomfortable content, uncomfortable experience, provocation, dissonances, things that don't add up, things that don't square with each other, things that don't make sense, and just learn to tolerate that frustration and basically to welcome it, because we can, in a sense, we can't resolve everything in the world. It's not like we're going to resolve everything, but we can make ourselves a better platform, a stronger platform to hold things that don't always reconcile, that are not always pleasant or even just, you know what I mean? To make ourselves stronger psychologically. Okay. And I think that it's easy to talk about, but we're talking about conditioning. And I think that, if I could hope for anything, I would hope that in our society, in our culture, as much emphasis as we place on being physically fit, that we could also place just as much emphasis on conditioning ourselves for the other marathon of our life, which is psychological, being able to hold things, being able to carry, to carry the load of all the discomforts and, multitasking, frustrations and injustices, and to be able to not crumble so easy and to have more resilience, more psychological fitness. Okay. And I think as people develop more psychological fitness and a more realistic picture of what it means to be sort of a healthy person, okay, and even an abundant person, that it's always understood that part of it is our psychological conditioning. Okay. If that became more known and more underlined in our society, I think that would actually reduce narcissistic fantasy in people, because people would understand, it would just become well known that you can't really have all the abundance and all the health and all the good looking and all that without also having that psychological conditioning. Okay, so it's just an opinion, but I think it also has ramifications in politics, because I think a lot of our politics, the way we sort of infantilize the poor, we sort of let them off the hook. It's sort of like, well, what can we give you? As opposed to also focusing on the conditioning element. I think conditioning is that missing element that I think we need to talk more about. It needs to be more known. Just, if we're gonna take the trouble to focus so much on physical health and having a good body, well, we can also talk about having more psychological conditioning. And I think that's a big missing element as we're dealing with cluster B and poverty in general. Okay. And so this doesn't just have ramifications for psychology. This also has ramifications for politics and the politics of dealing with the poor. So anyway, just leave it. I want to leave that idea with everybody that, as we look at cluster B, addictions, cluster B, and that kind of area of psychology, I think the concept of poverty, I think, is very much a part of that. And I think, as we reflect on cluster B, on addictions, I think we should always be reflecting on the phenomenon of poverty. Okay, because I think that's what we're really talking about, And if I just want to leave with one final theme, you can't talk about poverty without talking about areas where people are lacking in conditioning. Okay, so if I were to advocate for anything, it would be conditioning in the broadest sense, and that to me is, there is no real healing or real recovery without focusing on conditioning in the broadest sense. So anyway, really appreciate you guys listening and wishing everybody the best. Talk to you later.